really quite spectacular ones. The region is a stunningly beautiful one. Volcanoes, rivers, sandstorms, rainbows from 30,000 feet. Really incredibly impressive. A lot of these areas actually are frontier areas between countries. So for example, this is Lake Turkana, bordering Kenya and Ethiopia, for instance. This is Bujumbura, very close to the frontier with DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is the Mountains of the Moon in Uganda, which border the Democratic Republic of Congo. And finally, if I can see that clearly, I think that's Akagera. So you can see Tanzania in the distance. What you can't see from 30,000 feet are the borders. You only realize that there are borders there when you come into land. And this has some very negative impacts, I think, the borders that we have on the continent. So this is what I'm going to be explaining in my presentation. So I see this very much from the point of view as an economist. And the borders raise three particular kinds of challenges. One is scale, the other is the lack of slow pace of job creation, and the third point is really how trade hasn't acted as a catalyst for growth on a continent in the way it should. So if you look at an outline of the African continent, you will appreciate the many, many borders, over 110 borders across the continent. Musa Faki Mohammed, the former chairperson of the African Union, once described the African silhouette as a shattered mirror, and I think that's a very apt description of what you can see there. Now, very interestingly, in the early 1990s, people are perhaps not aware, but India and China were actually poorer in per capita income terms than the African continent, very significantly. What's happened since the 1990s, I think, is very revealing. If you look at the rate of economic growth for the African continent, in green here, you see that it's been significantly lower over these last 3.5 decades compared to India and China. And China is now in a situation where it's at least 6 times the per capita income of the average for the African continent, and India is also now substantially wealthier. Now, one of the reasons that we could attribute for that poor growth is precisely the problem of the fragmented market, the borders, that increase the costs for people doing business. There is a publication, an American publication called Fortune 500, which each year publishes a list of the largest companies in the global economy. Back in 1990, China had just 3 companies in that list. Fast forward to today, and you will see that China now has 133 companies in that list, par on par with the United States. An incredible transformation in this economy. How many companies in the list, the Fortune 500, do you think Africa currently has? It's a very easy answer, 0. Africa does not have a single company in the Fortune 500 list. And the Cameroonian economist Achaleke made a very pertinent observation. He likened large companies to baobabs. He said that you need those larger firms to basically create an ecosystem under which smaller and medium-sized firms can thrive. If the baobabs are cut down, you no longer have the protection and the ecosystem falls to pieces. So the absence of doing things at scale and the absence of sufficient number of larger companies has an economic cost for the continent. Another major challenge for the continent, which we're all aware of, is the slow pace of job creation. It's very difficult for young people to find gainful employment. Typically, we would think that as a country develops, employment will shift from the agricultural sector into higher value-added and better paying jobs in the industrial and services sector. On the African continent, unfortunately, this is not what we've seen over the last 3 decades. We've seen almost stagnant structural transformation, very movement of people into the industrial or services sector. So this again is a major challenge. Not enough jobs are being created outside of agricultural sector. Now, one way African countries have tried to deal with this challenge is by exporting. But typically countries have prioritized exporting to high-income economies, particularly the European Union or the United States of America. And African exporters have been offered preferential market access over this period to access those markets. Unfortunately, these schemes, for many reasons, have not worked as people intended. And if you see here in the chart, you can appreciate the share of exports actually going to either Europe or the United States has really fallen very sharply for Eastern African countries over the last 2 decades. Africa has also tried to make use of the international trading system. We now have 44 African member states which are currently members of the World Trade Organization, in the belief that being active members of the global trading system would help turn this story around. But unfortunately, as you can see in this chart, the share of Africa in global trade has barely budged in the last 20 or 30 years. It's stayed at around 2 or 3% of total global trade. So Africa is sadly underrepresented in terms of global trade. And I think even more crucially for the continent, 80% of what Africa exports to the rest of the world is commodities, raw, unprocessed goods, minerals, oil, or raw coffee, tea, etc. Julius Nyerere, the first president of independent Tanzania, once said, we consume what we do not produce, and we produce what we do not consume. And that is still very much true for the continent. To remove these borders so that we have a less fragmented market. And in our book, this is such an important move forward for the continent. Now, you may be aware the African Continental Free Trade Area was signed at a historic meeting of the African Union here in Kigali back in March 2018. Ever since that happened, there has been quite a few misconceptions, nevertheless, about the true nature of the AFCFTA. A lot of people claim that it is an imported idea, that it's a free trade area that Africa does not want or has not sought. In our book, we try to clarify that misconception and explain at some length that the AFCFTA really represents historic Pan-African ideas about how to achieve greater continental integration and economic cooperation amongst member states. We particularly in our book lean very heavily on the intellectual ideas and the academic research of people like Professor Adebayo Adedeji, who was the former executive secretary